Okay, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon, everyone. So my name is Andris Sprūts. I am director of Latvian Institute of International Affairs. I'm also professor at Riga Stradiņš University. So today I have the pleasure to welcome all of you at the discussion on the future of international system, transatlantic relations, Western-Russian relations as well. We have had a very long day of discussion since early morning. The public event is part of the wider process of discussion and dialogue, namely the Riga dialogue process. So we started already yesterday, and we came to quite a number of interesting ideas, conclusions, proposals, and I think you will see and feel some of them. Actually, we live in very troublesome and challenging times. So we are in trouble, to put it shortly. At least we may picture it like this. It's a global disorder. It's a word which some would call with three uns: uncertainty, undiscipline, unpredictability. It's, as Charles Kupchan was saying, it's no one's world. He predicted it. So basically, there is no ownership by anyone, which is perhaps good, but at the same time, of course, it also creates a lot of challenge, and if not to use the word mess. Transatlantic community, NATO is not anymore obsolete, at least it's a good news. But at the same time, some would say the NATO is on probation for Donald Trump. And Donald Trump, of course, creates some challenges, it seems, for transatlantic solidarity. It's also Turkey, one must remember, as a part of the transatlantic community in NATO. On West Russia, we started our discussion with the concept that it's basically now the new normal between us, West and Russia. But then we have a lot of corrections. New abnormal, hot peace, Cold War, light Cold War, hybrid Cold War, and managed confrontation, cooperative confrontation. And I think we can continue with the list. But basically all this reflects that we are in troublesome waters in general. On the Baltic region, 2014, I repeated from time to time that 2014 was end of post-historical nirvana for the region, when geopolitics, it seems to be coming back, when great power ambitions coming back, and sort of course, when we realize that ghosts of the past are not so far away as well. There was a silver lining for the Baltic Sea region. It still remains quite stable. There is also the good practice of deterrence and dialogue at the same time. So you can look from the silver lining perspective that things have not deteriorated as far as even some could have expected, even though we are in challenging times. So what's next? What's next for us? What's next for international system? What's next for the transatlantic community? What's next for the EU? There's also a new government in, for instance, Italy right now. What's next for the Western-Russian relations? So I think we have a very distinguished set of panelists, and it's not always the chance to bring such a distinguished panel to Riga, and I think we very much appreciate that we have succeeded in bringing, and of course it's thanks to the distinguished speakers and participants themselves. It's also thanks to the partner organizations which have supported us, and you can see, and I will not name all of them. So this event is, as I once more mentioned, the part of the wider one, and also it's an annual event. So with this, I am stopping my introductory remarks. It's a pleasure to have the four speakers. It's Mr. Andrei Kortunov, who is the president of New Eurasia Foundation, Director General of Russian International Affairs Council, also a good colleague and good friend of ours and good partner of ours, and we also co-organized this event together. We have Mr. Vigaudas Ušackas, who is now director of Kaunas Technical University, the Institute for EU Studies, as I understand, and a former ambassador to EU and also former Minister of Foreign Affairs of Lithuania. And there are some rumors about your next position. But it's next year, I understand, so it's not yet known. Then we have Dr. Fritz Felgentrau, who is a member of the German Parliament, Social Democrat Party. I must also mention that you are a politician and classical philologist. So this is your background, so you can have the wide reach of also ideas on perhaps a bit philosophical approach to things, what happened. And last but not least, Leo Gabriel Michel, who is a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council in the Washington, D.C. So we have all stakeholders here, the Baltic perspective, American perspective, Russian perspective, and German perspective. Let's start. Fritz, let's start with you immediately. So what's next? So silver lining of those troublesome waters, really.
Oh, it's already working. Well, first of all, Andris, let me thank you for inviting me, and I must say it's been a very enlightening and fascinating day. Also, it's my first time in Riga and in the Baltics at all, so it's also been a very educational journey, and I'm very glad to be here. The discussion we had today, I felt encouraged by it for several reasons. One, most importantly, because I had the feeling that we did have an actual dialogue in a spirit of openness towards towards each other's arguments, which I have not always encountered over the last 4 years. I remember occasions not completely different, where where people from the Western side and from the Russian side were sitting in the same room, but they were really talking about different things and more at each other than with each other. And that is not very fruitful. Today, I think it was better than that. And this is a good sign. What has led us to this? I believe that after the sharp and incisive events of 2014, I think that in the years afterwards, on two levels, the West has proven its resilience. First, through the NATO summits of Cardiff and of Warsaw, and the results that have come from that, that have sprung out of those. I think this was particularly important for the Baltic states as well, because in the immediate aftermath of 2014, there has been a lot of doubt on whether the Baltic NATO states could rely on NATO, and I think these doubts have been mostly removed. This is something I was very intent within the German debate too, that this commitment was beyond doubt, because I fully believe that if any NATO member state could not fully rely on Article 5, then NATO would be devaluated completely. So it was very important to make that clear, and I think NATO has succeeded in making that clear. On the other side, the EU has proven a lot of has undergone some dramatic developments over the last 3 years. The most consequential one being the Brexit, and yet the EU also has proven its capability of resilience, resistance to populist movements in at least 2 of the big member states, particularly France. And the ability to come up with new concepts for a closer cooperation, particularly on the field of security and defense, which I believe is also very important. Both developments have been strong signals towards the Russian Federation, and this is important because I think that when you have a strong and powerful neighbor like Russia, in order to have fruitful dialogue, both sides have to take each other seriously. Both sides need to have a position of strength from which to argue. And as long as the European Union didn't have that, maybe that was one of the reasons why dialogues were so difficult in the past. I do hope that the positive developments we have noticed within the EU over the last couple of years have contributed to the Russian side taking the EU a bit more seriously. Although I don't know how far this really goes, and we'll see how we continue from here. But all of this being said, when we're looking at the future, I think one important idea that has come out of this conference was the idea of talking about something like a new détente policy for Europe in the next 12 months. Détente being a word, vocabulary that comes from the world of the Cold War, but which could nonetheless help isolate actual problems that we're having and help us formulate a path towards solutions. The most complex and virulent one being the war in Ukraine, which needs to be overcome in some way in order to have any kind of foundation for the rebuilding of trust between the two sides. And so, if we look at these two aspects, coming up with the idea of a new détente, which has a lot to do with transparency and with finding local solutions for local problems. And the way to proceed in Ukraine, this was something that basically Andrei Kartunov started his presentation out with this morning. We have one concrete idea that has been put forward, which is what's the English term again? A peacekeeping mission for the so-called republics of Lugansk and Donetsk, the occupied territories in Ukraine. If it was possible to find a concept for such a peacekeeping mission that both Ukraine and Russia could live with, this would be a strong signal that a détente could work. This is nothing that could be negotiated over the heads of Ukraine in particular. It would have to be something, whichever shape it would take, that would have to be completely acceptable for Ukraine. Otherwise, it wouldn't work. But if this really could be made to happen, I think it would be a very positive signal also for other fields of conflict. And that this is not to be taken for granted is obvious, and that we still have a lot to overcome in order to reach a working détente, for me was made clear, for example, also by the experience of the large autumn maneuvers last year, Zapad 17, which in my opinion was in violation of the Vienna document, and yet, of course, shows that the kind of transparency we'd need for that kind of policy to work is at least not what we're having at the moment, but that we've been able to kick that ball around all day today, I think was a very positive signal. And speaking of kicking the ball around, I do hope that the upcoming Soccer World Championship will also show that we can all meet in a spirit of friendly competition. So maybe this is enough as a starting point for the discussion. I think it's very important to hear also the ideas of the audience and the questions of the audience in this context. Thank you.
Fritz, thank you so much. If I immediately still to use my privilege of being a moderator and to have a follow-up question. You mentioned about the importance of negotiating and speaking from positions of strength and resilience. And I think European Union has proved that we are able to, let's say, accumulate the position of strength and speak from position of strength. I think we have sustained also resilience in the past. The question is exactly what's next. Are there some risks that it might be difficult to sustain it? There is a Brexit on cards. There is again, I once more would mention Italian new government. There is some business projects as Nord Stream 2, for instance. How you see this resilience being sustained? Or are there some risks, or you would say that not really? Is it basically on the fundamental issues we agree on?
The risks are evident, and I think the European Union as a concept is still being called into question from many sides in order not to use the word attack. I think that the current American government views the European community, the European Union, more as a problem and as a competitor rather than something that contributes to stability and prosperity in the world, which is a problem, which is a major problem for us because we have always counted on the benevolence of the American side in our endeavors to create a more unified Europe. And the idea of the EU as such is being challenged by, for example, by the Russians and by Russian, by Russian communication within Europe in order to avoid terms like hybrid war. All of this is real, and it has changed our reality, and we have seen the doubts in the successful conception of this project grow within. The Brexit would not have been possible without that, without these doubts growing. And we see that Italy will now have a government that consists of two parties that are actually very critical, if not opposed to the European Union. So all these risks are there. But I think that the positive signal that we can take from the development of the last couple of years is that these challenges do not mean that the only possible outcome is that Europe will fall apart in some way or other, but that Europe has proven resilient in the past, and that I trust in the substance of the idea and in the growing support for the idea that is also happening in a dialectical process within Europe that will make it possible even to negotiate solutions with a difficult Italian government in the coming months, and that in the long run we will stick together and fight for the project that has proven so valuable over the last two generations.
Thank you. Let's proceed. Andrei, the Europeans, at least in some quarters of Europe, we are ready for the 10th. Mr. Putin has been re-elected. Is President Putin ready now for the 10th as well?
Well, thank you, Andres, for inviting me, and I'm very happy to be here. And I appreciate that you were able to gather such an audience, though it is already 20 after 5. But let me say that, as George Orwell once said, the challenge of a scholar is not to predict the future, but rather to capture the present. And I think that what we did over the last day and a half, we were trying to capture the present. And Fritz has mentioned, and you also mentioned a couple of times, the word resilience. You applied it to the West. I think that to be fair to Russia, we should also argue that Russia turned out to be more resilient than many people hoped it would be, or feared it would be. Indeed, 4 years ago, many thought, not just in the West, but in Russia itself, that probably the country would yield under the pressure of economic sanctions, its economy would go down the drain, Russia would be completely isolated in the world, the popularity of Mr. Putin will plummet, the political opposition will rise to the occasion, and we would have some major changes, if not a regime change in Moscow, at least a very serious change in the Russian position. Well, nothing like that happened. And we saw that the Russian economy survived sanctions. The Russian government turned out to be quite professional and quite adaptive. They manage exchange rates, they manage currency reserves, and of course, higher oil prices also help. Back 4 years ago, nobody expected that today we would have oil prices higher than $70 a barrel. The political system has also demonstrated a degree of flexibility and adaptivity, and I think that we should not dismiss the results of the recent elections in Russia as something that was fabricated or achieved in completely fake procedures. Indeed, whether we like it or not, but Mr. Putin remains a popular leader, and a majority of Russians are still rally behind the president. We can also argue that Russia made a couple of spectacular accomplishments internationally, including the operation in Syria, despite all the reservations and hesitations that many people had. So we have the resilient West on the one side of the equation and the resilient Russia on the other. And this is not likely to change anytime soon. I don't think that we can expect any drastic changes on either side, capitulation or major concessions, which are already in the pipeline. Another point that I would like to make is that, of course, the situation is not normal. Of course, the situation is deplorable. Of course, there are risks related to the situation. But let me tell you that, at least in my view, both sides mastered the ability to manage their confrontation. And indeed, unfortunately, the Minsk agreements are not implemented in full, and people are killed in East Ukraine, which is, of course, very regretful, but we haven't seen a major escalation in Ukraine. Of course, there are no mill-to-mill contacts right now between Russia and NATO, but again, we haven't seen a single incident involving Russian and NATO warplanes or warships. We were able to avoid inadvertent escalation, and as the recent US strike in Syria suggests, there are some lines of communication still open, at least on the ground. Yes, we can argue that NATO deployed 4 battalions on its eastern borders, and Russia reciprocated, but again, to the best of my knowledge, nobody talks about a real arms race between Russia and the West. On the contrary, the Russian military defense expenditures are going down, at least for the time being. So the situation is not good, but the situation is not apocalyptic. It doesn't mean that we should disregard the risks. It doesn't mean that we should sit on our hands waiting for something. I don't know what we can be waiting for, but definitely it means that we should be ready to live through a potentially quite extended period of adversarial relationship. And this adversarial relationship has in its roots not just the Ukrainian crisis, which was, of course, a major catalyst for the confrontation, but what we see is divergent visions of the world, of the international system, of what is right and what is wrong, what is legitimate and what is not legitimate in the international relations. And more importantly, divergent visions of the emerging world order. And it would be tempting to say that there is Russia on the one side of the barricades and the West on the other side of the barricades. But I think that it would be more accurate to argue that this borderline cuts across countries and political parties and continents. Mm-hmm. If you take President Trump, I think it would be fair to say that, at least in certain ways, his vision of the world is closer to that of Mr. Putin than that of Mrs. Merkel, for example. Trump is a nationalist, but Putin is also a nationalist. Trump is a transactionalist, but so is Mr. Putin. Trump doesn't trust international organizations, but neither does the Russian president. So I think that it is a little bit more complicated than sometimes it is presented in the Russian or in the European media. Now, I don't want to take too much of your time, but let me just give you my vision of what we can do right now to avoid further escalation and to reduce risks in this primarily adversarial relationship. First of all, I think that what we need is to stabilize the relationship, which means that we should restore communication lines that were blocked or incapacitated for some time. It means that to the extent possible, we should try to resume political and military dialogue. We should try to avoid inflammatory or insulting rhetoric on both sides, and in my ideal world, we should stop the information war which takes place right now between Russia and the West. And, of course, if we do that, we can proceed with a practical agenda. Ukraine remains the cornerstone, the stumbling block, the most explicit obstacle on the way to better relations. I think that, unfortunately, it will take a lot of time to resolve the Ukrainian problem completely, and I think that can be done only within a new European security architecture. But I think that there are certain things that can be done right away. And I agree with Fritz that one of the most evident challenges that we should confront is international peacekeeping in East Donbass. I see no reason for this challenge to fail. Russia doesn't want to annex Donbass. To the best of my knowledge, Russia doesn't want to leave Donbass as a kind of large, unrecognized state. Russia sticks, at least it claims that it sticks to the Minsk agreements. It's about the modalities. It's about the mandate of the peacekeeping operation, about the territorial deployment, about the composition of the peacekeeping force, about how it is related to the implementation of the political sections of the Minsk agreements, how it is related to humanitarian assistance, but all these problems are solvable. Neither of them requires an unconditional surrender or capitulation of either side. The situation is, of course, complicated by the fact that Ukraine has entered its own election period process, and that definitely limits the ability of Ukrainian politicians to compromise or to demonstrate flexibility. But I don't think that it is impossible. Second, I would also argue that what we have to do is to preserve what can be preserved. And indeed, when we are talking about the Russia-West confrontation, it is a very odd confrontation. If you look at the statistics of last year, you'll see a major increase in trade between Russia and the European Union, something like 27-28% of increase. You'll see a major increase of trade between Latvia and Russia. And I think it is also important. Russia is a country which receives more Schengen visas than any other state in the world, and this is something that should be also taken into account. Europe remains the major destination for Russian students who would like to study abroad. The European Union remains the largest partner. Okay, I think that you don't want me to shed more optimism, so let me just say that on top of very specific issues that we can handle right now, which do not require a lot of political capital to be burned on either side, we should also think about the future. Because especially when we're talking about the younger generation of people here and in Russia, they need to have a vision. They need to have some prospects for a more comprehensive solution of our problems. If we can energize them, if we can incentivize them, then probably some of our problems will be resolved much sooner than we think that they can be resolved. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrei. Thank you for your insightful and slightly positive outlook, which differs from some of also previous ideas what we have discussed, but I think it's also good to hear and good to see that there are also this positive and optimistic dimension to it. Of course, I would have many questions to you, but I hope let's move forward. Certainly there will be questions from the audience, so let's move forward to Leo. Thank you, Andrei, once more. I think we always appreciate Russian perspective. Leo, what is Trump's vision? Andrei defined it. Would you agree with it? And what Trump's vision mean for transatlantic relations and also for the Western-Russian relations? Please, Leo.
Thank you, Andres. And I will come to that, but towards the end of my presentation, which, given the hour, I believe I'm going to follow that secret to a good presentation, which is known as the 3 Bs. Be brief, be sincere, and then be quiet. At last year's forum, which took place here in Riga, there was also a discussion of this phrase, new normal. in terms of the West's relations with Russia. And I admit that I cautioned participants at the time that they should not assume that the prevailing tense situation, tense already at that time, would last, because in fact it could get worse. And it gives me no pleasure today that I have no reason to change that assessment. Russia does continue extensive military and other involvement, directly and indirectly, in the Donbass region of Ukraine, where the conflict has already taken over 10,000 lives. And the OSCE reports virtually daily fighting. Meanwhile, Russia persists in an illegal annexation of Crimea, which is part of Ukraine territory, in fact, as recognized by Russia in various declarations. In this region, we have seen provocative Russian military activities at sea and in the air, as well as ground force deployments and large exercises like Zapad. Earlier this year, as I understand it, the Russian government twice notified Latvia that it was planning to conduct missile tests over Latvia's exclusive economic zone in the Baltic Sea. Meanwhile, President Putin, in his Valdai speech last year, personally refuted the US finding, which I will remind you was first made by the Obama administration, but later reaffirmed under the present administration, that Russia had violated the 1987 Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty, which is and should be important to Europe. And in his State of the Federation speech on March 1st, President Putin put a lot of emphasis on Russia's new, what he called invincible nuclear weapons systems, and even featured the simulated targeting of Florida by multiple nuclear warheads on a large screen display behind him. And if that type of saber rattling were not enough, then perhaps the use of a deadly nerve agent to attempt to assassinate a former Russian spy now living in the United Kingdom might have caught your attention. Of course, Russian officials deny any involvement in the matter, at one point even suggesting it was really a plot cooked up by the British Secret Services. Really. Outside of Europe, I'm afraid the situation is no less serious. I could point to Syria, where Moscow seemed to declare victory last December, but is still quite involved in ground and air operations there. In some ways, Russia has become a de facto ally of Iran in Syria, since the Iranians have also invested very heavily in preserving the Assad regime. And finally, in the 11 months since our last conference in Riga, more and more has been revealed about the extent of Russian interference in the 2016 US election campaign. And you are also aware of Russian meddling and disinformation in elections and political debates here in Europe. But for the US, just last week, I will point out, the Senate Intelligence Committee released a bipartisan, and I will underscore bipartisan statement on its findings that Russia's efforts to influence the US election were, quote, extensive, sophisticated, and ordered by President Putin himself, which actually reaffirms the findings of the US intelligence community in January of 2017, and were done for the, quote, again from the Senate report, for the purpose of helping Donald Trump and hurting Hillary Clinton, unquote. So this is not fake news. This is not a witch hunt. So I'm going to end with a little bit of good news for you, and also not so good news. The good news is on NATO's strength and deterrence posture in this region. As you know, there are multinational battalions in each of the Baltic states, plus Poland, and better and more realistic exercising and, in some instances, pre-positioning of military stocks. Now, certainly more will need to be done to ensure prompt reinforcements are available if necessary to strengthen deterrence, or perhaps actually to defend this region in the face of important Russian, what we call anti-access and aerial denial capabilities. But these are not insurmountable tasks, and I think NATO will be serious about taking the needed steps. I have heard from time to time calls from some Baltic experts for a significant permanent US presence on the ground in this region. But from my perspective, once again, I'm not a government official, but based on my experience, I don't believe this is going to happen, at least not in the near term. The United States has a global posture that puts heavy demands on US forces, which must also consider other possible priorities, such as North Korea. And if the US places forces in one Baltic state, I would assume that the other two would want the same. And finally, it is very important to recognize and to maintain the commitment of our Canadian and European allies to the deterrence and defense missions here in the Baltics. It's important for you, it's important for the health of the entire alliance, and it's also important, I would argue, for continued strong bipartisan support for NATO in the US Congress. Two other positive signs: we've seen increased cooperation of two other regional partners who are not members of the alliance, Finland and Sweden, cooperation with each other, with the United States bilaterally, perhaps now trilaterally, and also with NATO. And while it hasn't been easy, and I recognize it hasn't been easy, the EU, for the time being, has maintained solidarity with regard to Russian sanctions, or sanctions on Russia connected to its intervention in Ukraine and its responsibility in the nerve agent attack in the UK. But I must finish, I'm sorry to do this, with not so good news. I personally have not seen, in either deeds or words, real indications of a forthcoming change in Russian policies, which, as I briefly outlined, are the root cause of the tensions in relations with the West. While I am not an expert on Russia, it still seems to have profound demographic problems, serious environmental challenges, a struggling economy that is overly dependent on hydrocarbons, and it has few real allies in the world. So while I don't see another reset in the near future, I tend to agree with those who say that we perhaps should worry as much about Russian weakness as Russian strengths. And my final points pertain to my own country. It is not good news for the transatlantic relationship that this administration has taken steps on the Iran nuclear deal, on trade, on refugees, or the handling of the still volatile situation with North Korea that have raised some serious questions among our oldest and closest allies about US credibility. I wish that more members of the administration would take to heart the wise words of the current Secretary of Defense, Jim Mattis, who said this to US military personnel in a speech last fall, and I'll quote the Secretary. He said, "Nations with allies thrive, and those without allies decline. It's that simple. But we must be willing to do more than listen to our allies. We must be willing to be persuaded by them." And he concluded this with the following sentence. He said, "Not all of the good ideas come from the nation with the most aircraft carriers." End of quote. I would also add it is not good news for the transatlantic relationship when domestic politics in the United States have become so polarized that some of our proudest and most important institutions, such as the Department of Justice or our fiercely independent media, are subject to tirades from certain political leaders. So I hope I've been brief. I've tried to be sincere. But before I'm quiet, I want to remind you of that famous quip attributed to the British wartime leader, Sir Winston Churchill, when he said, "You can always count on the Americans to do the right thing after they have exhausted all other possibilities." We should only hope that Sir Winston's backhanded compliment still remains true. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Leo. Last but not least, Vigaudas Ušackas. Vigaudas, I see the trajectory here. Quite optimistic that there is a chance for the 10th. Less optimistic, but with some elements of optimism. Already bleaker picture. Thanks God that there was still a good final touch on the optimism with regard to transatlantic relations. Vigaudas, so how it is for us in the Baltic Sea region? I mean, we directly neighbor with Russia. So for us, like two things. On the one hand, insecurity feeling. On the other hand, necessity to cooperate, necessity to trade with our neighbor. So how to combine these two things of insecurity and necessity actually to engage? Please.
Well, thank you very much, Andres. First of all, let me thank you and your colleagues from Latvian Institute of International Affairs for creating a conducive environment for a sober, frank, and realistic discussion instead of kind of discussion living in illusions or in hypocrisy, which to some extent was a cause where our relationships have led to in terms of the West-Russia relations. Immediate response to your question is, well, we have to be well-informed realists. What is feasible, what is untangible. And I think, first of all, we have to acknowledge where we stand in the West-Russia relations. I mean, I still continue my line that we have to be honest in acknowledging that we face a profound clash of the worldviews between Kremlin and the West. I do not attribute that to entire Russian nation, although, as Andrei said, a majority of the Russians support President Putin. However, we do face a profound difference between Kremlin and the West, and it starts from the fundamental difference on the right of choice of our common neighbors, Georgia and Ukraine, to choose their alliances and associations. Failure to respect the international rules-based provision that the countries have freedom to develop their relationship have caused, and of course, I mean, the response which was used by Kremlin to legally annex Crimea and to launch hybrid warfare, both in Ukraine and vis-à-vis the West, are the root causes to which Leo and others have attributed to the current state of affairs. But it's not only about Ukraine and Georgia, with all due respect. It's also about the differences when it comes to the core democratic values, European values, as we consider, such as civil society activism, political pluralism, freedom of speech, which are being rejected in Russia in current times. It's also about what we're witnessing, an effort to disrupt and discredit liberal democracy in the West, meddling into internal affairs. It's also about the protectionism in trade, weak rule of law, as well as policies of localization and import substitution, to what several speakers today have referred as a distinct system of development of Russia, be it in economic terms or be it in political terms, rejecting international rules-based system and promoting kind of zero-sum game approach on when it comes to the security policies. So the fundamental question for us is what should we do and how should we respond? And if you narrow that to the Baltic interests, is of course for us, three Baltic nations, is of critical importance that the Western liberal democracies and community of shared values remain united, both within the European Union, but also as much as feasible through our transatlantic friends, United States, Canada, and others. And that's why we need to demonstrate our economic and political resilience, resilience of our societies to that meddling. We need also to demonstrate our consistency in implementing the EU energy strategy. And that's why, for me, the Nord Stream 2 does not correspond to the energy strategy of the EU as it was outlined by the European Commission, and should not be pursued because that provides an opportunity for Kremlin to divide and govern, or at least undermine European unity and our consistency. It's going to be about our staying power in terms of implementation of sanctions, linking that to the Minsk implementation. Yes, the agreement on the UN peacekeeping force would be an important, but let's be realistic. It will not solve the problem. It will freeze the conflict, which by itself might be, it is important and useful, but it will not solve the problem because for President Putin, Donbass is something what he considers, from my point of view, as a golden share to impede Ukraine's modernization and impede Ukraine's Westernization, which he will not give up. It is of critical importance, and we are thankful as the Baltics to all NATO allies, but especially the Brits, the Canadians, the Germans, who have contributed with the military for the reassurance and deterrence. I still believe that American presence is of critical importance, because that's what Kremlin respects and understands. It is of critical importance that we continue to support Ukraine in its modernization efforts. But alongside of our military deterrence and reassurance, as we have discussed, we should also define and design some of the policies which would help to reduce uncertainty, to damage control, and prevent further deterioration of our relations or happening some military accidents due to miscalculation or different perception of security threats. And I think that's where the OSCE platform could be of use, alongside to the military deterrence efforts allocated by NATO vis-à-vis the Baltic states. Last but not least, as it was mentioned, we should continue our support to civic society in Russia to promote people-to-people contacts, especially with the youth. And we should draw the lesson from the past. From my point of view, I was until recently rather well-informed realist, as the former ambassador of EU to Russia. I don't envisage, personally, any changes in Russia internally or externally. But if after 2024 Russian citizens decide to turn back to European way and to re-embrace European values, an international rules-based system, we have to provide a credible road for it by drawing attentions on the lessons learned, but also reminding that that road, the way to European integration, goes through the Kiev, through Ukraine, and respect of Ukraine's independence and sovereign choices. So, in the sum up, I think we are at this stage facing a new normal which will be accompanied by a kind of muddling through fashion, that we will find ourselves in a context of certain contentions and disagreements, like over Ukraine, but we may also find ourselves compelled to deal with Russia and to cooperate on issues such as Iran, Syria, or Afghanistan. Thank you.
Thank you, Vigaudas, for the Baltic perspective, and I think it adds to the picture, sort of showing diversity of approaches, diversity of emphasis, but at the same time still also the bringing the hope that there are some elements of convergence as well in the picture.
Not mutually exclusive.
Absolutely so. Let's open, since I was willing to ask some questions, but taking into account that you had extensive and very comprehensive speeches, so I will immediately go to the audience for some questions from the audience so that we can come back, and let's take the questions in rounds. Please introduce yourself, and you can certainly address a particular person, particular speaker. Please. Yes, I see the hand over there. Yes, please.
The Embassy of Ukraine, Alisa Podolak. If I may, I would like to make a comment, because Ukraine is the topic which is discussed here, and I would like to thank all the speakers for their resolute positions, and to tell Mr. Kortunov that there is no Ukrainian crisis. There is the crisis of Russia, and the only reason for all this aggression is the crisis of Russia. And Ukraine is not the stumbling block in your relations with the West, but Ukraine is the reason why the West should toughen its sanctions on Russia. Thank you.
Thank you for bringing also Ukrainian perspective here. I think it is important. Yes, please. Yanis Eikmans.
This is a question to Mr. Kortunov.
Please introduce yourself.
Oh, do I have to?
Yes, please.
This is my voice carried.
No.
Oh,
No.
no, okay. My name is Janis Eichmanns, and I'm a former ambassador of Latvia. I was curious by Mr. Kortunov's comment about the fact that Mr. Trump and Mr. Putin are very much alike. And I wonder if you could elaborate on that to the extent that do you foresee that in the not too distant future, for example, when this whole business with interference of Russia in U.S. elections is over, that maybe the two of them could sit down somewhere. Because I think all along, certainly Mr. Trump has indicated that he would like to have that meeting. Now, you may recall not too long ago, it was I think a couple of months after the election, that BuzzFeed said that there was a secret document that was handed to the White House in which it outlined all the things that this discussion could be about. Do you know anything about that, or could you elaborate on that? Thank you.
Thank you. So please, some other questions? Yes, please. Over there. Yep.
Andrew Tatarchuk, sorry, Andrew Tatarchuk, journalist of Сегодня Daily. Recently, I visited last week ago. I visited Kazan, Tatarstan. It was a summit under patronage Vladimir Putin. It's named Russia Islamic World, with participants, for example, Islamic Development Bank or Organization of Islamic Cooperation, and 100% trend Russia. We in European Union lose economic Russia and our issues Russia, because in this conflict, it's my opinion, and for example, opinion from President of Tatarstan, Rustam Minilkhanov, Russia is return to east side, for example, China and Islamic world. Question to Mr. Kortunov and Mr. Michel, do you agree?
Okay, and let's have another one. Let's have a last question for this round. Yes, please.
Thank you, panelists. I am Dr. Yasin Prasad. I teach European study in Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi. And I am here in connection with my project, India-Baltic relations, economic, political, and trade challenges and prospects. And all. I'm lucky to be here. I'm very thankful to Professor and his students who has invited me here in this seminar. When you are talking about Russia and President Trump, our perspective, like the Asian perspective, particular perspective from India, like when American president says UN has become talking shop, it's a talk shop, and NATO is obsolete. Same with Mr. Putin, who has got a relation, whether we have got evidence, the American election, where there's hobnobbing. Here, we have taken a lesson from our past. Thanks to European Union and Europe West as a whole, that after Second World War, 70 and more years, you have not gone for another war. And here the basically hope, ray of hope. When the whole world is in turmoil, China, as India, faces a very undemocratic country. China is a neighbor who is also trying to encroach upon our land and all. Pakistan, on the other side, is also a threat for our integrity, national integrity. We are also facing the same problem. And here we look forward ray hope from West, particularly European Union. President Trump has gone to the extent that Germany had done a mistake by allowing refugees, and there will be more Brexit. So President Trump is not very sympathetic for European Union integrity. So here we think both Russia and America is not in a very good position to support the integrity project of European Union. Here, as democratic India, multi-ethnic, multicultural, multilingual, we have been a spokesman of unity and brotherhoodness of world. So we should also look forward, and we look forward from you. India is a big say in maintaining the present world order. Thank you.
Thank you. Let's go back to the panelists. Andrei, all the questions are to you. No, of course not the bulk of them, but certainly all of the panelists are kindly invited to
well, first of all, on President Trump and Putin, I think that why in Moscow they were happy when Trump was elected. I don't think it was because they expected a US-Russian alliance, but because Trump confirmed the vision of the world that they have in Moscow. Here in Europe, Angela Merkel says, Mr. Putin, you live in a different universe. If you remember a couple of years ago. And she implied that Mr. Putin lives in his world of fantasies. And the real world is that of the European Union with its values, with its rule-based system, with its balance of interests, and everything which is attributed to the European model. Now, if you look at elections in the United States, if you look at the rise of populism in Europe, if you look at the imploding Middle East, if you look at nationalism in Asia, you can say, yes, Putin lives in a different world. But Europe has still to prove that its world is more real than his. And you know what? The jury is still in session. We don't know. We can only hope that the liberal world order will prevail, but we can no longer take it for granted. Now, on a meeting between Putin and Trump, of course there were expectations a year ago that the two guys get together and they will have a grand bargain, and that will resolve the problems, if not of the humankind, at least of their respective foreign policy agendas. Now these hopes are no longer there. I think in Moscow they understand that Trump is boxed, that Russia is a toxic asset for him, that whatever he does with Putin will be used against President Trump by the Hill or by the political opposition, by the Washington establishment, if you wish. So expectations have been moderated. However, I think there are still hopes that the two leaders will meet, because that's how the US-Russian relations always proceeded. Election campaign, tough rhetoric, then a summit meeting, and something starts moving. They don't have a different way to handle the relationship. But I have to tell you that, to the best of my knowledge, no practical preparation for such a meeting is underway. Trump made a statement, I think in March, about the meeting, that it would be helpful, but basically nothing followed. So I'm not sure that we'll have such a meeting anytime soon. We can have a meeting on the margins of G20 in Argentina, but I don't think it will really be a game changer. At least I would be very surprised to see it as a game changer. Now, on this shift of Russia to the east, I think it is natural. Everybody is looking east. Everybody is looking on China. Not only China, but other emerging Eastern economies. I think that what Russia should keep in mind, and this is a point I'm trying to make in Moscow every time I can, is that a geographical shift cannot and should not be a substitute for structural changes in the Russian economy. Because no matter whether you look east or west, but you will hit limitations if you do not make your economy more dynamic, more adaptive, more innovative, and so on. So I think China is important, and we see growing trade between Russia and China. There are changes, I think positive changes in the structure of the Russian-Chinese economic relations, but definitely Russia still has a challenge. As a challenge which is domestic, which is not foreign policy. And finally, in terms of India, and I cannot avoid that, I think that the worst thing that might happen to the Russian foreign policy in Asia is the need to make a choice between India and China. Because we have good relations with both New Delhi and Beijing, but these are very different types of relations. I would say that with India, it's like a long-term marriage with no children. With China, it's a wide love affair without a formal marriage. I think that both models have their liabilities. I think it would be not easy for Russia to balance this relationship, but I think that if Russia makes a choice, no matter whether it is choice in favor of China or India, that would be a major defeat of the Russian foreign policy.
Thank you, Andrei. Leo as well, I think there was about a similarity of...
Thanks. I will skip the question. I think Andrei is better positioned than I am to speak about Russia's rebalance towards its Asian neighbors. But a brief mention on three topics. On President Putin and President Trump, I hesitate to make any comparison of policies here. I think one thing that's interesting to, I should say, any comparison of personalities. I think one thing that's important to put out is that, at least until recently, there's been something of a gap, apparently, between the president's view of Russia and of his counterpart there, and many senior members of his own administration. I say until recently because, as you know, there's been a change in the National Security Advisor and the Secretary of State. And this is seen in different ways. It's seen with regard to the extent and the motives of Russia for its interference in our election. It was seen in different ways in terms even of Russian, how to respond to Russia's actions in Ukraine. It took some time for the president to be convinced, and even at that point it was very low-key publicly to authorize at the end of last year the sale of lethal defensive weapons to Ukraine, such as anti-tank missiles and sniper systems. Reportedly at one point he was urged in capital letters not to congratulate Mr. Putin on his election victory. I put that in air quotes, and he went ahead and made a point of doing that. So there's this dissonance, if you will. With regard to the United Nations, yes, the president, as a campaigner, and also as president, has made statements about how he views the UN. Actually, his ambassador to the United Nations has said some, at least on occasion, more positive things. But there has been a general tendency, I believe, in the administration and from the White House to undervalue, I think, alliances, undervalue multilateral institutions. And I think this is to the detriment of the United States. And it's also quite a shift in traditional U.S. approach. I probably need not remind this audience that the United States, yes, we've had over the decades differences on commercial agreements, but the U.S. fundamentally has been a champion of European unification, not only in its dealings with the EU directly, but also, of course, through NATO, which, if there were not the security backbone in Europe, the chances of having peaceful European, greater moves towards integration and unification would have been a distant hope. Unfortunately, his attitudes seem to be more in a zero-sum game. We've heard a lot of that phrase recently, and I think that's, personally, I believe it's short-sighted. And I would say that the EU will remain an important, very, very important partner for the United States. Most of those countries in the EU are also our allies in NATO, and we shouldn't think that they are schizophrenic. We should treat them with respect in both institutions.
Thank you. Fritz, if you have some short reaction.
Maybe just a very short reaction to what the other distinguished members of the panel said after I had given my first 3 minutes. You were saying that we won't be able to solve the problem with a peacekeeping mission in Ukraine, and I perfectly agree with you. That is not the point. When we were arguing this afternoon at the conference for a new détente politics, it's not about détente is not about solving the problem. It's about diffusing a couple of bombs, and what kind of bombs we might have in mind was what Leo enumerated. I think there is still a long stretch to go until we actually can speak of problem solving. But what little progress we think feasible, we should try to pursue.
Thank you.
That's
exactly,
not to prolong, but that's exactly what was my point. It's about freezing the conflict and preventing for further proliferation. But the core of the issue is somewhere else. It is about disrespect of free choice of the nations to develop associations.
Just to make the point, the OSCE today said that the last 7 days were the worst week in the Ukraine conflict this year, with, I believe, 10 dead soldiers.
Thank you. So, and we have a chance for the second round of the questions, so please, but this is the second and last round as well. So, yes, please.
Ines Sabirsin, a former MP in Latvia, on its way to EU and NATO membership. I would like to hear whether you have serious concerns about the fissures that are opening up bigger gaps within the EU, like the Hawaii volcano is doing. We have, Brexit, we don't know what that's going to be. A pseudo-semi-membership, 1 foot in, 1 foot out. We have Poland and Hungary naughty boys that want the money, but they don't want to take responsibilities and toe the line. We have the new Italian government. We have Russia economic interests in Hungary, in some of the candidate countries in the Balkans, which I don't think we should overlook, Serbia, Montenegro, etc. Do you have serious concerns? Do you have belief that EU will rise to the challenge successfully?
Yes, Hans, please. Yeah.
Yes, my name is Hans Prask. I'm Denmark's ambassador here in Latvia. First of all, I would like to say that I'm very glad to be here and to support the Riga dialogue. I think it's a very, very useful and important initiative you've taken. We need dialogue. We need to walk on 2 legs. I think we agree on that, but it's not so easy to walk on one of the 2 legs, and that is to have this dialogue and how to develop it. So if I may ask the question, how do we come from here to support this initiative? In my country, we also want to have a dialogue, but it's not so easy. It's not so easy to find good people to have a dialogue with, which is not based on lies and that we are not sitting and telling things that have no reality in life. So I support very much this initiative. I hope you can carry it more forward. We would like to have something similar, but could you give some ideas as to how we can move forward?
Excellent, thank you. Yes, please. Mm-hmm.
Good afternoon. Andris Melakaus, Ministry of Culture. I came to this discussion with the idea of taking to task Fritz Felgentreu about the SPD's connection with Gazprom, but I'll put that aside, but Andrei Kortunov came up with a very interesting proposal that we should stop the information war. Well, we in the West didn't declare it, but the idea is very interesting because it would be great to divert resources from fact-checking and debunking to promoting actually serious and genuine journalism. Another idea that could be good, and many I think have raised, is increase people-to-people contact. The OSCE has a brilliant program of getting together Ukrainian and Russian journalists, but I'm thinking also about ordinary people promoting tourism between the West and the East. And would it be possible, do you think, to reduce the costs of visas, because I think they're very high, and would that be an effective mechanism to get people to talk to each other?
Thank you. So, some other questions or comments? The last ones, please use your opportunity. Yes? Here? Yes. We also should have a younger generation, so it's great that you have a question as well, so because it's the future of our relationship, please.
My name is Aiden Houston. I'm from Сегодня magazine. I wanted to ask a little bit on the American perspective. We've heard a little bit from Mr. Kortunov, who has offered options, ways that we can solve the situation, agreements on peacekeeping and things like that. The American perspective seemed a little bit more negative, a little bit more pessimistic. I wonder what kind of future you see for Russian relations and how, from the American point of view, we can improve those relationships.
Okay, thank you. So I think what we do in a reverse order. I would add to the ambassador's question as well, I think, from a little bit different angle, pretty much the same question, so to all of you as well. So what exactly could be done? What is the key to promote the dialogue in next, let's say, 6 or 12 months, so that we meet in a year's time and we can say, yes, some progress has been achieved and some steps have been made. We make it in reverse order because, Fritz, you should prepare for this alleged Gazprom connection to SDP. So that's why. Let's start with Vigaudas.
Well, thank you, Andres. I mean, it's we can have many dialogues as long as someone listens, as someone receives sets of recommendations and consider that for a policy making, which I hope it's going to be the case. I mean, the dialogue by itself is a virtue, and it's worthwhile to do that. I mean, because especially in the times of tensions and disagreements, we have to have links between not only experts but also the people, and that's why I'm so proud. Some people were referring on the significance of having people-to-people contacts, and during my term in office, we managed to double the EU budget for student exchange, which is now reaching this year more than 4,000 Russian students going under the EU Erasmus Plus scholarships to the different European universities, which is twice larger than it was the case before the conflict over Ukraine. And I hope these links will pay off in the medium and longer term perspective. But I mean, the bottom line is indeed, whether the political leaders are eager to take some of the recommendations which we can put forward. Nevertheless, we should continue doing that.
Leo?
I can't respond to all of the questions. Let me, as an American, but one of a French background, my father was French, say one thing about the EU. I was assigned by the Pentagon at one point in the late 90s to a job in Europe, actually in Switzerland, and I had to go and pick up my car, which had been delivered to Antwerp. And I took the train to Antwerp and got in the car and drove back. And I crossed several borders on the way to do it. And I was never stopped by a policeman or by a customs agent. And this is particularly emotional when you cross the border between France and Germany near Strasbourg, knowing that in the past 100 years they had fought 3 wars. So today, now France and Germany do not agree on every issue. There are certainly cultural differences. But the idea of war, going to war against one another, is gone. It is gone from the mentality of those 2 countries. That is something that the EU has contributed. I would argue that NATO and the United States have as well, but before you get too carried away with your Euro pessimism here, you shouldn't forget what you've accomplished already, and that other things could be accomplished in that way. It would be wonderful in this dream world that at some point, and it could be in the far distant future, that we could have a similar vision of progress with Russia. But I listed all of the problems. I won't repeat all of them. I don't see this turning around for the near future. So I would say, and I know I have a strongly defense background, I think you need to buckle up. You need to think about deterrence. You do need to think about defense. But as an American, I would also say that Americans, and many Americans in this administration, I'm afraid to say, have to think a lot more about American soft power. I come from a background that was very much oriented towards military and hard power, but it's not hard power that counts for US influence in the world. And if our soft power begins to deteriorate and disappear, even with our closest friends and allies in the world, which are Canada and Europe, then we are not in a good space. And just one last comment, because I don't want to take too much time. Someone mentioned that we shouldn't waste time with fact-checking. We should think about serious journalism. Fact-checking is part of serious journalism. And there has been too much disrespect for facts, or as some advisors will call them, alternative facts. We do need fact-checking. It serves a very important role. And I'm all in favor, and I try to contribute it to myself from time to time. Thanks.
Andrei.
Well, you know, a couple of references were made here to the need to restore dialogue. And indeed, it is important. But, you know, I recall a quote which is attributed to Moltke the Senior, who allegedly stated, "Shut up if you want to talk to me." And I think that unfortunately, you know, this is something that we see between Russia and the West right now. I think it's important, especially for diplomats, to understand that the job of a diplomat is not to make a point, but to try to solve a problem. And I think that means responsibility of the profession. The same I would attribute to scholars. And my concern is that this borderline between between research analysis on the one hand and politically loaded propaganda on the other is disappearing. You can say that it is disappearing in Russia, but I'm afraid that the West is not immune to this disease either. And the expert knowledge is to a large degree discredited, and that's why, you know, we have fake news and post-truth world. I think it's responsibility of scholars, it's responsibility of journalists. I don't know whether we can impose it on them, but at least, you know, we can try to appreciate what is being done by people with integrity and people who are trying to change anything. And finally, you know, let me say that I agree completely with the idea of, you know, more exchanges, and I think that one of specific steps that can be made on this side of the barricades. Maybe we need some kind of visa liberalization for students and younger people coming from Russia to Europe and to the United States. Right now, I can tell you that it is practically impossible to get a US visa in Moscow. Forget it. You know, I don't know how they get there, but it is a long, long line. Now I think it's 2020 or something like that when you have to sign in. So I think that has to be that has to change if we want to think strategically, not just in terms of action, a reaction cycle, which is clearly a short-sighted approach.
Thank you, Andrei. Fritz, concluding remarks.
Well, Andrei, shut up if you want to talk to me, at least was not the motto of this conference, which was a good thing. I think we did have a very good conversation here, and maybe we can carry this with us and use the impulse in our own countries. Second of all, Andris, first of all, as a classical scholar, let me congratulate you on your deft handling of the figure of Praeteritio. But aside from that, formally I would say there are no connections between the SPD and Gazprom. There's just one famous member of the SPD who has a very close link to Gazprom, which is a difference. And referring to that member, a week or so after the inauguration of President Putin, I was quoted on the front page of the Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung as saying, Gerhard Schröder has achieved great merit for our country, but what he is doing now is far removed from what I expect and wish for from a former chancellor. I hope this answer satisfies you. Aside from that, you were asking about the fissures in the EU and whether the EU will be able to rise to the challenge. Well, I don't know. I just think that having identified the challenge is a first step. This also refers to all the detrimental effects of disinformation. I believe that, not contradicting anything you just said, realizing that you are the object of a disinformation campaign is already a very, very important step towards refuting it. So these are the challenges that are there. They are real. They are having an effect. But I also trust in the substance of the EU, and if I didn't, I'd stop being in politics. So I think we have to face the challenge, and we have to have a public, open, and transparent debate about everything connected. But I still think that most responsible elites in all our countries realize what a great thing the EU is, and what it has done for Europe, and for peace and prosperity in our very violent region of the world. And I do think, and I do have confidence that we will be able to overcome the challenges. But whether this confidence is well-founded, only the future will show.
Thank you, Fritz. This has been really good to have also concluding positive note in our discussion. Western Russia is the new normal. If I sort of add my own some notes, then I like to repeat the description of pessimist and optimist in the region. The pessimist is who says that we have reached the rock bottom. That's it. It cannot go worse. The optimist says, no, we can still get worse. Our relations can become even worse. I would like to be a pessimist actually in this regard, that we have reached the rock bottom and we can think about some kind of bouncing gradually back. It is, as was mentioned, from unmanaged conflict, potentially we have come into the managed conflict. At least there is element of management. But I think there are still risks of being entrapped in, let us say, this negative rhetorics, negative narratives, negative perceptions, mutually exclusive perceptions, and also increasingly strategies of our countries. So my final, or one of the remarks would be, let's have expectations management for the agreement, that it will not be fast, it will not be quick. Some sort of what Vigaudis was mentioning, muddling through, we're used to it. We are used to it, and I think it's nothing new as well in a way. So we must agree to disagree with each other. There are differences and fundamental differences, but at the same time there are also things in common. So the EU's language or parlance of selective engagement, there is some element of applicability to it. So a dialogue in good faith, this has been about a dialogue in good faith. We've been conflicting in our positions, in our approaches, in our interpretations, but I think this is exactly what dialogue is about. So that also to start already more fruitful, productive, and fundamental engagement. So thank you to such a wide audience coming for the speeches and discussions and raising the questions. Thanks to the partners for supporting this one. Again, a long number of partners. Being present and being supportive in terms of the funding, in terms of the ideas. And last but not least, exactly this public event, but this is a part of the wider event. But this public event, of course, thank you to the speakers for engaging, for enlightening us, for providing different views, so the showing the diversity of opinions as well here. So thank you so much. So please join me in a round of applause.